Welcome to Liber Radio, the totally real podcast about history through a liberalist lens. I'm Victoria, and for our first episode, I'm going to be talking about Clinton's involvement in the Somalian humanitarian crisis with my co-hosts, Bridget and Maya. But first, we have to address the question of what is liberalism. Unlike modern political perceptions, liberalism is actually a theory of international relations, which has four main tenets. 1, international collaboration. 2, importance of domestic affairs and values. And 3, relevance of morality. And that kind of branches off into emphasis on democracy and freedoms. So what does the collaboration bit mean? It just means that that liberalists believe it's possible to maintain sovereignty while recognizing international law and collaborating within a system of anarchy. So they believe, first of all, anarchy just means that there isn't an overlord world government that forces everyone to do everything. It just means that states have independence and sovereignty, which allows them to make their own decisions. And sometimes they'll decide to collaborate. That's what liberalists believe. Secondly, they believe that domestic issues affect international issues because states aren't black boxes. And that this sort of branches into the morality bit, where they believe that democratic states tend to be more peaceful because of the effects of the tenets of democracy, which is called democratic peace theory. And with this emphasis of morality, they also believe that peace is born out of the freedom of individuals, because if individuals are allowed to choose, it'll be in their interest to avoid conflict. So that's a brief recap of what liberalism means. But now the question is, what happened in Somalia that connects to liberalism? So I'll hand it over to Bridget.
Right. So Somali independence was achieved in 1960. And the US established relations with Somalia soon after, but that relationship became strained when Somalia allied with the USSR in the 70s after a coup leading to a dictator with socialist tendencies. This then led to a brutalist paramilitary organization and another kind of conflict where the dictator was deposed of. But the resistance forces that deposed of him soon after fractured, leaving a massive power vacuum where no central government reemerged, right? So the economic sector crumbled and corruption increased. And there was massive infighting between the various factions that once made up kind of the resistance group. And this all triggered a massive humanitarian crisis where almost 4.5 million people, over half the estimated population of Somalia, were threatened by severe malnutrition and malnutrition-related diseases, most of which were living in rural areas.
So the United Nations obviously wanted to interfere with this staggering humanitarian crisis, so they created UNISOM, the United States operation in Somalia. UNISOM was approved in April 1992 to distribute food and security, and the United States sent in additional aid in August of 1992 under the Bush administration. However, due to violent resistance against aid, UNITAF was created on December 9th, 1992. This was spearheaded by the United States, although it was only authorized by Congress after the fact. It was meant to create a protected environment for humanitarian operations and deployed around 37,000 troops by December 1992. In 1993, Bill Clinton became the first president inaugurated after the Cold War, which means his foreign policy had the freedom to consider liberalism for the first time in many years. This led to him having 3 foreign policy priorities: updating and restructuring American military and security, elevating economics, and promoting democracy abroad.
Okay, so thank you to Maya. So in the same year, in March, UNITAF actually started transitioning to the second phase of UNISOM, which is UNISOM 2. Whoa. This was because there was a lot of resistance, specifically in Mogadishu, against relief supplies, put up by one dude, a warlord called Muhammad Farah Adid. And his faction escalated violence and violated established ceasefires that were established with UNISOM 2, whose purpose was disarmament and reconciliation and helping reestablish infrastructure, both economic and political, in Somalia. So UNISOM II and all this conflict with Muhammad Faradi led to the Battle of Mogadishu, which was a turning point in US collaboration with UNISOM II. So on October 3 and 4, 1993, the US set out on a mission to capture two of Adid's lieutenants. However, it went really bad, and it resulted in an 18-hour-long urban firefight right in the middle of Mogadishu that left hundreds of Somalis and 18 American soldiers dead. Because of the Black Hawk helicopters that were shot down during this battle, it's often called colloquially Black Hawk Down.
Right. So following the deaths of 18 American soldiers in Somalia, there was massive backlash in the American public. This was furthered by the publication of images like the one on the screen, the body of an American soldier dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, which created a really visceral reaction in the American public. On October 8th, 4 days later, Bill Clinton addressed the nation in a speech where he stated that he was actually going to send more troops to Somalia to protect and maintain the kind of like aid that had already been happening there, and promote the Somali people reaching peace, right? One of the things Clinton establishes in this speech is this idea that it is not the US's role to build a peaceful, like democratic government in Somalia, that the Somali people have to do that themselves, but it is the US's role to kind of facilitate that peace and provide stability in the meantime. However, he does still withdraw all American troops by March 1994.
In the end, liberal democracy never really succeeded in Somalia. In 2007, the African Union stepped in to push extremist groups out with some American training and supplies, but extremist groups still hold a lot of power in a lot of more rural areas because they're funding things like schools and medical care. There's a common sentiment now that if the United States went in and tried to rebuild Somalia, liberal democracy would take hold, but constructing democracies rarely works because democratic peace has specific requirements, which are in the Kantian triangle: democracy, international organizations, and economic interdependence. The last one is the key because the United States used international organizations to try and enforce democracy, but failed to recognize that the conflict in Somalia wasn't ideological. It was based in political and economic instability.
Liberalism really relies on ideological conflicts, right? Two of the most successful kind of like cases with liberalism would be like the American Revolution and arguably the French Revolution, right? And which are conflicts that are based in people fighting for kind of like more ideological goals, right? Like they're both very based in this idea of like personal freedoms. That was not what was happening in Somalia, though, right? The conflict in Somalia was economic, and people in the middle of an economic crisis aren't necessarily focusing on kind of like, you know, their nation's sovereignty, right? They're focusing on a much more individual level on survival and getting food and medical attention, right? The US and the United Nations also kind of failed to fully examine the ramifications of the fact that Somalia wasn't quite a war zone, right? There were no clear sides in the conflict in Somalia. It was much more of an anarchic state, right? Which meant that along with there being no sides, there was no clear ideology in any part of the conflict, which prevented kind of any like external ideologies brought in from taking hold. Right? In conflict or cooperation, that says, right, theory is necessary, but no one theory offers any confidence that the wrong choices will be avoided. The failure of liberalism in Somalia is in a lot of ways down to the fact that the context of the conflict wasn't fully examined, and the ramifications that it would have were not realized.